Ancient Greek architecture is known for its influence and beauty. It emerged from the 8th century until the 4th century BC. Greek culture took shape in the interaction of two diverse people, the Doric and the Ionian. By the 8th century, the two groups became one that we called the Hellenes. Greek architecture is encompassed by a variety of structures, including temples, civic buildings, theaters, and stadiums. But today we are going to focus on the temples that had a special significance in Greek society. They were considered sacred spaces dedicated to the worship of their god and goddesses, and it serves as a link between the mortal and the divine. It was where the Greek would do their religious devotions, where they would do their rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices. Let's note that there are two big orders, the Doric order and the Ionian. And the orders are not just the columns, but the whole temple, its plan, its structure, its proportions, shape, etc. In the first part, we're going to talk about the Doric order. Then we will talk about the Ionic order in the second part. So the Doric temple is supported by 3 large steps, including the stylobate where the temple rests. And for the proportions, the total height of the steps is equal to the lower diameter of the column. The Doric column has no base and it goes upward with a convex curve. The geometry of the column is an illusion, a response to the weight of the temple, which is the superstructure, through the graceful and muscular effort of the column. We can see it like it's holding a big thing like strong arms. Also, the Doric capital is a smooth transition from the round shaft to the rectangular superstructure that is on top of it. There are 3 elements in the capital: the necking, the echinus, and the abacus. Then the roof has decorations with sculptural pieces, and there are even sometimes sculptures of monsters and even of men. The temples were actually painted with bright colors, unlike what we think of today. For example, the triglyphs were painted black and dark blue, the metopes were painted red, and these exotic colors were not decorative, but they served to articulate and balance the forms. Now let's talk about the plan of the temple. For the Doric temple, we had the cella, which is the body of the temple. It's the essential core of the temple, and it was usually very dark. The only source of light was from the entrance door. The cella of the Doric temple was divided into aisles by rows of columns. These rows of columns were more aesthetic than structural, because without it, it would be too large in the comparison of the exterior and would not be an appropriate enclosure for the sacred cult image. That's why they had those rows in the middle. So going back to the columns, some would be monolith columns and some would be built with drums. They're cylindrical stone blocks. Also, interior columns were shorter, but the support had to rise higher to reach the ceiling. So the solution was to set a second tier of columns on the first. Some remarkable archaic Doric temples that we know were the Paestum, the first temple of Hera built around 550 BC. And we also have the Basilica, which incorporated some elements of the Doric, and it kind of differs from the ideal Doric temple because there's a sort of difference in the plan. The cella was divided into 2 aisles by a single row of 8 columns, and there would be 9 columns in the end, which would be unusual. And the central column's forms were more solid. And then there would be 18 lateral columns, more widely spaced than those on the ends, which also was unusual. And if we look at the Temple of Hera, it is much closer to the Doric norm. It's divided by 2 double-tiered Doric colonnades. So we have 4 aisles instead of having 2 divided by a row of columns like I have presented before. Here we have 2 rows of columns with 8 of them. And instead of having 18 on each side, they had 14. And the load of entablature was still heavy, but it no longer seemed like it was crushing the echinus. The echinus, by the way, is the lower part of the capital. We can also talk about another very interesting temple building that is very known today. It's the Parthenon. It was located on the Acropolis. It was a religious and cultural center. The Parthenon was designed by Iktinos and Kallikrates in collaboration with Phidias, and it was completed in 432 BC. Within a few hundred years, its ruins had begun, but it has always been transformed. For example, the interiors were restored by Romans, then the Byzantines converted it into a church, and then the Catholics into a cathedral, and the Turks into a mosque. And it always had changed, but in the origin, its design was affected by the cult image of the goddess Athena. Now, let me describe to you a bit how the temple was. It was a U-shaped path framing the structure around the goddess statue, which was in the middle. It was a golden goddess statue. The stilobate was unusually wide, and the design of the columns had a paradoxical architectural effect. The colonnade was dense, but yet the columns soar in their slenderness. It was slender but dense. The huge entablature was very monumental, but seemed like it was floating. And the effects of this are due to unique proportions of the Parthenon. First of all, the solids seemed lighter because the columns were drawn closer together, and there was this unusual curvature. The entire temple floor rises gently towards the center, and nearly all the vertical elements, including the columns, were leaning inwards. The entrance door to the cella was also curved, and it just made all of this sort of effect because of the proportions. We can see this astonishing degree of craftsmanship and passion for architectural perfection. And this is a supreme example of the Doric temple, but it's not the typical one that we know. Also, another thing is that there are 4 Ionic columns in there. Talking about Ionic, we are going to the second part, and we're going to talk about the Ionic order. The Ionic order is less pure and less determinate. It is softer, richer, more pictorial than the Doric. At the base of the Ionic temple, there is a stilobate, but without the 3 steps that we find in the Doric. The shaft of the Ionic column, unlike the Doric, does not stand directly on the platform. It is set on a base. And the base varies. They have low cylindrical bases, and later it became square. They were square plinths, and so plinths are the base. And then in the base, there's a torus, a spira, and a plinth. Also, the Ionic capital was very distinguishable. It's a double scroll with a strong curl. And the Greek moldings were very important in the element of the Ionic entablature. The moldings would rise vertically and project horizontally or lift diagonally. A few examples of the Ionic order and the Ionic ideal would be the Temple of Athena Polias in 340 BC, designed by Phidias. And there were also Ionic temples at Samos and Ephesus, the Temple of Artemis, for example. And the columns were widely spaced, the entablature was higher. The earliest Ionic building and the most exceptional is the Erechtheion in 420 BC. The Erechtheion had facades all different on each side, and it had a combination of columns and different sizes of columns. There is actually a variant of the Ionic order, which is called the Corinthian order. It retained the features of Ionic, but it just had a new type of capital with 2 concentric layers. In conclusion, the Doric and the Ionic order had different styles, different designs. The Doric columns were sturdier and simpler, while Ionic columns were more slender, more pure, adorned with volutes. The entablature of the Doric temples had triglyphs and metopes, while Ionic temples had a continuous frieze. Doric temples were associated with strength and power, while Ionic ones represented grace and beauty. But both orders had their regional preferences and cultural associations with ancient Greece. Until today, these temples have influenced so many buildings in the history of architecture. Another conclusion that I can say is that the Greeks did not build great houses or imposing tombs. Their architectural energies were not directed to private life or the afterlife, unlike the Egyptians with their tombs. It was more of the public life that counted for them. The Greeks believed that humans are social creatures, and that idea shaped their temples, their cities. It also reflected on the spaces that they inhabited. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you on the next videos.